It was well past midnight when I returned home from work, the familiar quiet of the neighborhood offering little comfort as I walked up to my apartment. The air was cool, and the streets were eerily empty, save for the faint hum of distant traffic. I unlocked the door and entered, ready to shed the weight of the day. As soon as I set my keys down on the table, the phone rang. I glanced at the screen. An unknown number appeared. For a split second, I hesitated, but curiosity got the best of me, and I picked it up. The moment I answered, there was only static. The sound was faint but sharp, as though the call were coming from some far-off place, an unknown distance away. Then, through the crackling, I heard a voice, soft, tender, unmistakably familiar. It was my mother's voice. She had passed away 2 months earlier. The voice sounded weak, almost fragile, like it was struggling to reach me. It whispered my name softly, as though testing the waters to see if I was still there. I stood frozen, unable to move, every cell in my body screaming that this couldn't be real. Her voice was strained as it continued, words barely forming between the static. She mentioned something about being lost, about not wanting to leave me behind. She spoke as if there was something after her, some invisible force that she could feel but couldn't explain. It was chilling. Suddenly, the line cut off. The phone went dead. I stood there, staring at the device in my hand, my mind racing. I wasn't sure whether to laugh it off as some technical glitch or to be terrified by the reality that seemed to be settling in. But something deep inside me knew that this wasn't a simple accident. I set the phone down on the table, my hands shaking. The weight of the moment hung in the air, suffocating me. I didn't know what to make of it, but I had to do something. The next logical step in my mind was to visit her grave. Maybe some part of me believed I could find an answer, some explanation that made sense. The cemetery was quiet when I arrived, the faint moonlight casting long shadows over the headstones. I made my way to her plot, trying to shake off the unease that had gripped me since that strange phone call. Standing before her grave, I ran my fingers over the engraved name, the finality of it all weighing on my heart. It was then that my phone buzzed in my pocket. With trembling hands, I pulled it out and saw that there was a voicemail. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the name that flashed on the screen, my mother's name. I pressed play, bracing myself for whatever came next. The message was faint, crackling with static, but I recognized her voice immediately. She sounded frantic, terrified. In a whisper, she spoke again, this time pleading for help. She mentioned something about being taken, about an unknown force coming for her and not knowing how much time she had left. She begged me to come back, to not leave her behind. But the message cut off abruptly, leaving only a hollow silence. I stood in the cemetery, my body frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The cold air seemed to grow colder, the weight of the situation settling over me like a thick fog. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. But no matter how hard I tried, the impossible nature of it all made everything feel unreal. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. Work became a distant thought, my every moment consumed by the memory of those unsettling messages. I had to know more, had to understand what was happening. I returned to her grave every day, desperate for some kind of sign. Every time I visited, I found the same disturbance in the soil. The earth looked as though it had been disturbed, almost as if something or someone had been digging beneath the surface. But there was no explanation. I found nothing. The phone calls continued. Each one was more desperate than the last. My mother's voice was growing weaker, pleading for me to save her from something that I couldn't see. With each call, I could feel the boundary between the living and the dead growing thinner. Something was reaching across that boundary, trying to drag her back from the other side. And then one night I received another call. This time the voice was not my mother's. It was something darker, rasping through the line like nails on a chalkboard. It spoke to me in a language I didn't understand, something ancient and malevolent. It said that I should have left things alone, that the dead should stay dead. The call ended with a sharp click, and for the first time I felt the full weight of the danger that surrounded me. I could no longer ignore it. I was caught in something I didn't understand, something that went far beyond grief and loss. I needed to act before it was too late. I returned to the cemetery one final time, armed with a new sense of urgency. As I approached my mother's grave, I saw something glimmering beneath the earth, something small and metallic. I kneeled down, my hands trembling as I uncovered a small, ornate key. It looked old, tarnished with age, and as soon as my fingers touched it, the air around me grew heavier. A sudden chill gripped my body, and I could almost hear her voice in my mind, faint but clear. She had never wanted me to find this key, but it was too late now. In that moment I understood. The key wasn't for unlocking a door, it was for unlocking something that should have stayed buried. And now I feared that whatever had followed my mother had turned its sights on me. I haven't returned to the cemetery since that day. The phone calls stopped, but the feeling of being watched never left. That night the phone rang again, but when I picked it up, all I heard was silence. A silence that stretched on forever, thick with the weight of something that had yet to come. The first time I noticed something was off in that house was during the quiet hours of the night. It was an old, creaky place, a relic from a bygone era that had been passed down through generations. The walls were thick, with faded wallpaper peeling in spots, and the floors groaned with every step. The house, though charming in its own way, had a sense of history to it that felt heavy. It wasn't the kind of place that invited comfort. Instead, it whispered of secrets that had long been forgotten. I had moved into the house only a week earlier, wanting to escape the bustle of city life. The tranquility of the countryside was supposed to be a reprieve, a fresh start after a difficult few years. Little did I know that the house's stillness masked something darker. At night, when I would lie in bed, I began to hear whispers. They started faint, barely audible, like the faint hum of the wind slipping through cracks in the walls. But as the days went on, they grew louder, more distinct. It was as though the house itself had a voice that only I could hear. At first, I dismissed the sounds as the house settling. The old beams creaked and moaned in the night, after all. But as time passed, I couldn't ignore the fact that the whispers were almost too intentional. The sounds weren't random. They were soft, almost melodic, like words hidden just beneath the surface trying to make themselves known. I would lay still listening, trying to decipher them. But they always stopped when I tried to get too close. One evening, after a long day of unpacking, I decided to explore the house further. It was the only part of the house I hadn't fully investigated, the basement. The door was old, rusted at the hinges, and heavy, but curiosity pushed me forward. I pried it open, feeling the weight of it in my hands. The air that hit me from the basement was cold, the kind of cold that seemed to sink into your bones, reminding you that something had been trapped there for too long. The basement itself was dimly lit by a single, flickering light bulb. The walls were lined with shelves filled with dusty boxes and forgotten relics. I found nothing particularly strange, just old furniture and what looked like family heirlooms covered in layers of dust. But then I saw it, a small door at the far end of the room. It was sealed shut, hidden behind an old cabinet. The whispers, faint at first, returned. I approached the door cautiously, heart pounding in my chest. It was unlike the others I had heard before, deeper, more insistent. It seemed to come from behind the door itself, urging me to open it, as if whatever lay on the other side had been waiting for years to make its presence known. Without thinking, I placed my hand on the handle and twisted. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. I stepped forward, my feet heavy with hesitation, and reached for the light switch on the wall. When the light flickered on, I was greeted by a scene one wasn't prepared for. The walls of the room were covered in strange markings, symbols that seemed to shift and change the longer I looked at them. Some looked ancient, others more recent, but all were unsettling in their appearance. A cold, damp smell filled the air, mixing with the scent of old wood and mildew. At the far end of the room, I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat, a small wooden box, carefully placed on a pedestal. The whispers grew louder, urging me toward it. I could feel the weight of something ancient in the room, something that had been sealed away for a reason. But my curiosity got the best of me, and I couldn't resist. I crossed the room and reached for the box. As soon as my fingers brushed against it, the temperature in the room dropped drastically. I pulled my hand back, heart racing, but the whispers continued. They were louder now, filling my head with words I couldn't understand. My vision began to blur, and I felt dizzy, as though the very air around me was shifting, bending in unnatural ways. I backed away from the box, but my feet felt as though they were glued to the floor. The whispers rose in intensity, almost like a chant, surrounding me from every direction. I had to get out of there. I turned to flee, but the room seemed to stretch, the door now impossibly far away. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. I found myself standing in the middle of the room, breathing heavily, as though I had been holding my breath for far too long. The box was still there, untouched, but the atmosphere in the basement had changed. The whispers were gone, replaced by a heavy silence. I knew, deep down, that whatever I had just experienced wasn't normal. The room seemed to pulse with energy, as if something was now watching me, something that hadn't been there before. I left the basement that night, locking the door behind me. I didn't go back for days, but the whispers continued, louder and more urgent than before. They didn't come from the walls anymore, they came from inside my own head. It was as though the house was alive, breathing with me, and whatever I had uncovered in the basement was now following me, speaking to me, trying to pull me deeper into its secrets. I couldn't stay there anymore. I had to leave. But as I packed my things and prepared to leave, the whispers grew louder. They were coming from everywhere, from every corner of the house, urging me to stay, to uncover more, to understand. But I didn't want to know. I didn't want to understand. That night, as I drove away from the house for good, I felt a strange sense of relief. But I could still hear the whispers, faint but present, following me down the road. They never stopped. The old mirror had been in my family for generations, a relic that no one ever thought to discard. It stood in the hallway of our ancestral home, framed in dark wood, ornate but slightly worn with age. The thing about it, though, was that no one could ever remember when it was first placed there. My parents didn't recall its origins, and my grandparents could only say it was always part of the house. At night, it was a different story. The mirror had a peculiar way of catching the light, reflecting the hallway in a way that made the space feel wrong. There was something about the reflection. It wasn't quite the same. The hallway seemed deeper, the shadows too pronounced, and the air around the mirror always felt colder. No matter how often I told myself it was just my imagination, I could never shake the feeling that something was waiting within its depths. I had often heard strange rumors about the mirror, tales that drifted through the family over the years. Some said it was cursed, others that it was simply haunted. But I never took these stories seriously. After all, superstition had no place in my life. Or so I thought. It was on one sleepless night when I decided to test my resolve. I had been hearing whispers in the house for weeks, and though I thought they were just the sounds of an old house settling, they began to gnaw at me. The house was quiet, the usual creaks and groans louder than before, and there was a constant feeling of unease in the air. It was then that I walked past the mirror, only to stop abruptly. There, in the reflection, was something I hadn't seen before. The hallway appeared to stretch unnaturally far. The mirror seemed to reflect more than what should have been there, far more than the simple walls and floor. There was something moving in the depths of the reflection, something that didn't belong. I blinked, unsure if my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, I saw it clearly, a figure standing in the far corner of the hallway. I froze. It was a dark shape, blurry at first, but its outline became clearer the longer I stared. It was a person, a shadowy figure in a long, flowing coat, standing perfectly still, staring directly at the mirror. But as much as I searched the hallway with my eyes, no one was there in reality. The feeling of dread hit me hard. I had no idea who or what was standing in that reflection. It was too still, too wrong, like an image frozen in time. I backed away slowly, my heart racing, trying to convince myself that I was seeing things. But no matter how much I willed it to disappear, the figure remained, unblinking. A chill settled in my spine as the air seemed to grow colder. The whispers I'd been hearing earlier returned, only this time they were louder, coming from the direction of the mirror. It was as though the reflection was calling to me, coaxing me to come closer, to step into the hallway that wasn't quite the same. The urge to turn away was overwhelming, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I reached out to touch the glass, half expecting my fingers to pass through it. But they met the cool surface, solid and unyielding. The figure in the reflection moved then, stepping forward as though responding to my touch. It tilted its head slightly, and I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see its face. A sudden surge of terror coursed through me, and I jerked my hand back, stumbling away from the mirror. The whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices in my head. The shape in the reflection followed my movements, its every action mirrored with eerie precision. I turned and ran from the hallway, my feet pounding the floor as I headed straight for the front door. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed me, growing louder, more insistent, filling the space around me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But no explanation seemed to fit. I had to leave. I had to get away from that mirror. When I reached the door, it wouldn't open. Panic clawed at my throat as I yanked on the handle, but the door remained stubbornly shut. My pulse pounded in my ears as the mirror behind me seemed to grow larger, more oppressive. The figure in the reflection was still there, still watching, its presence filling the hallway, now stretching all the way to the door. With a final desperate effort, I turned and ran deeper into the house, trying to escape. The voices seemed to be all around me now, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. I stumbled down the stairs, unable to shake the feeling that the house itself was alive, that it was watching me, waiting for me to succumb. Finally, I managed to break free of the house, running out into the night, gasping for air as the moonlight washed over me. But even then, I could hear the whispers, faint but persistent, as though they were calling me from the darkness. I never returned to the house after that night. I don't know what was behind the mirror or what had been waiting for me there. But I know one thing for certain: some things should never be touched, and some places are better left alone. My grandmother's house was always full of old things, relics from the past that had been passed down through generations, but none of them were as unsettling as the doll in the corner of her bedroom. The doll was an antique, dressed in a faded lace gown that looked too large for its porcelain body. Its hair, once golden, had turned a dull, lifeless brown over the years, and its painted eyes, though closed, had a strange quality. There was something about it, something off, that made me uneasy whenever I visited. As a child, I would always avoid looking directly at the doll, but my curiosity grew the older I got. Why was it there? Why had my grandmother kept it for so long? It had been in her family for as long as anyone could remember, a part of her mother's inheritance. She would often tell stories about it, but they were never the kind of tales that reassured me. There was always a tone of caution in her voice, like she was warning me without fully explaining. One evening, as I was visiting for the summer, I found myself standing in front of the doll. Grandma was in the kitchen, so I was alone. I stared at it, intrigued by its eerie presence. For reasons I couldn't explain, I felt a pull toward it. The more I looked, the more I looked, the more I felt like the doll was watching me, its eyes seemingly shifting under the glassy surface of its eyelids. I reached out and touched it, feeling the cold porcelain under my fingers. The second my hand made contact with it, a chill ran through me. The room grew colder, and I could have sworn I heard a soft whisper, too faint to understand, but enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I quickly withdrew my hand, unnerved by the strange sensation. That night I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was as though the house itself had become heavy, the air thick with an oppressive weight. I tried to fall asleep, but the whispers continued, growing louder, though no one was there. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the doll in my mind, its unblinking stare fixed on me. I didn't mention it to my grandmother. After all, what could I say? She would probably just tell me that it was my imagination. But I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. The more I stayed in the house, the stronger it became. I felt like I was being watched at every turn, like there was something hidden just beneath the surface, something waiting to be discovered. On the third night I awoke to a strange sound. It wasn't the usual creaks and groans of an old house, but something more deliberate. It was a faint tapping, like fingernails tapping on glass. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and glanced around the room. There, in the corner, where the doll had been, I saw something that froze me in place. The doll was gone. I jumped out of bed, my pulse racing, and ran to the spot where it had been sitting just hours before. But the doll was nowhere to be found. Panic surged through me as I stumbled around the room, checking every corner, every shadow, but it was gone. I could feel my breath quicken as the silence in the room grew deafening. Then I heard the soft whisper again, closer this time. It was as though the doll was speaking directly into my ear, though there was no one there. I turned, my eyes wild, scanning the room for any sign of the doll's return. It was then that I saw it, sitting in the farthest corner, on the floor, its eyes wide open. I ran to it, my hands shaking as I reached down to pick it up. As soon as I touched the porcelain, the whispering stopped. But in its place, I felt something colder than I had ever felt before, as though the very air around me had turned to ice. I felt a presence behind me, pressing into the back of my neck, but when I spun around, there was nothing there. The doll's eyes stared at me, unblinking, and I realized then that it wasn't just a doll. It was something more, a curse, maybe, or a spirit trapped within its porcelain body. It had been waiting, watching for someone to take it, and now that I had, it seemed to want something from me. Something I couldn't understand. I dropped it, my hands trembling as I backed away, my heart racing with terror. But even as I fled the room, I knew that it wasn't over. The doll would follow me. It would never leave me. The next day, I tried to act like everything was normal. I didn't mention the events of the night to my grandmother, afraid that she would think I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew the truth. There was something about that doll, something dark and ancient, and it wasn't finished with me. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the tapping again. But this time, it wasn't just on the glass. It was on the walls, on the floor, on the ceiling. Everywhere I turned, I could hear it, as though the house itself was alive, and the doll was moving through it. The whispers came too, soft and incomprehensible, like a chant that grew louder the closer I got to the doll. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to leave, to get away from the house, from the curse that had latched onto me. But as I grabbed my things and rushed to the door, I realized something terrifying. I couldn't remember the way out. The hallway had changed. The walls were different, the floor unfamiliar, like the house had rearranged itself. The whispers came again, this time with a warning. It was clear now that I was trapped. The doll had claimed me, and there was no escape. I don't know how long I wandered lost in that house. I've never spoken of it to anyone, and I never will. All I know is that when I finally left, I never returned to that house again. The doll stayed there, waiting, always watching. And I can still hear the whispers in my mind.